Unit 5, Period 5, 1844 to 177. Part 5.1, Contextualizing Period 5. Setting the stage. America at a crossroads. All right, let's talk about one of the most dramatic, chaotic, and ultimately transformative stretches in all of American history, Period 5, running from 1844 to 1877. If you think of American history as a novel, this is the chapter where everything that seemed like a slow-building tension finally explodes. And to understand why, you have to understand the world America was sitting in right before this period kicks off. By the 1840s, the United States is essentially a teenager who just hit a growth spurt and has no idea what to do with all that new size. The country is expanding rapidly, westward economically, demographically, and that expansion is forcing a reckoning with a question the Founding Fathers deliberately left unanswered. What do we do about slavery? The three big forces driving Period 5. Think of Period 5 as being shaped by three massive, interlocking forces: territorial expansions, sectional conflict, and the struggle over what it means to be American. These aren't three separate stories. They're the same story told from different angles, and the AP exam will absolutely test whether you understand how they connect. Territorial expansion is the match that lights everything on fire. The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. Which you'll dig into more in later sections, delivers an enormous chunk of new land to the United States. And immediately, almost before the ink on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is dry, Americans are fighting over one burning question: will slavery expand into these new territories? The Wilmot Proviso, which tried to ban slavery from any land acquired from Mexico, fails in the Senate but doesn't die. It becomes a rallying cry that reshapes American politics entirely. Here's an analogy that might help lock this in. Imagine a family that's been arguing about the rules of the house for years, but they've managed to keep the peace by just not talking about their really hard stuff. Then one day they inherit a massive new wing of the house, and suddenly everyone has to decide, do the old uncomfortable rules apply there? That's antebellum America in a nutshell. The new territories forced a conversation the nation had been desperately avoiding. Sectionalism, the fault line beneath everything. The other concept you absolutely must internalize for Period 5 is sectionalism, the idea that Americans increasingly identified with their region, north or south, more than with the nation as a whole. This isn't just a feeling. It's reflected in economics, culture, religion, and politics. The North is industrializing rapidly, drawing in waves of immigrants and developing a wage labor economy. The South is doubling down on an agricultural economy built on enslaved labor. And Southern leaders are increasingly constructing elaborate ideological defenses of slavery, calling it a positive good rather than a necessary evil. A common AP pitfall here is treating the Civil War as inevitable or as if it had to happen exactly when and how it did. Avoid that trap. The exam rewards students who can show how specific decisions, compromises, and failures made conflict more likely over time. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the collapse of the Whig Party, the rise of the Republican Party. These aren't just dates to memorize. They're dominoes falling in sequence. Reconstruction, the other half of the period. Here is something students often underweight. Period 5 doesn't end with the Civil War. It ends in 1877 with the close of Reconstruction, and that matters enormously. Reconstruction is the United States' first serious attempt to define what freedom actually means, legally, economically, socially. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are passed during this era, fundamentally rewriting the Constitution and expanding the definition of citizenship and rights. The AP exam frequently asks you to trace the long arc of these amendments and their contested legacies. Think of Reconstruction as the morning after a massive storm. The war destroyed the old structure, but now someone has to decide what gets rebuilt, how and for whom. Radical Republicans want a thorough transformation. President Andrew Johnson wants a quick, lenient reunion. Formerly enslaved people are fighting for genuine freedom and land and civic participation. The struggle between these visions and the eventual abandonment of Black Southerners, when Reconstruction ends, shapes American life for the next century. A mnemonic to hold it all together. To keep the big themes of Period 5 straight, try this. Were, expansion, slavery, transformation. Every major development in this period connects back to at least one of those four words. When you see an AP prompt about period 5, ask yourself which of those four forces is at the center of it, and you'll already have a framework for your argument. One last thing to internalize. The AP exam loves to ask about continuity and change. Period 5 is a period of radical, violent change, but some things persist. White supremacy, for instance, doesn't end with emancipation. It adapts, economic inequality shifts in form, but doesn't disappear. The tension between federal power and states' rights that defined the antebellum period continues right through Reconstruction. Keep your eye on what changes and what stubbornly stays the same. With that foundation in place, let's zoom in on this specific catalyst that launches period 5 into motion. Westward expansion and the war with Mexico that redrew the map of North America. Part 5.2, Manifest Destiny. The big idea, America's divine real estate claim. All right, let's talk about one of the most ambitious and, frankly, one of the most consequential belief systems in all of American history. Imagine your neighbor walks over one day and says, "God told me your backyard is mine." Actually, your whole block is mine. It's just my destiny. That's essentially what Manifest Destiny was, scaled up to a continental level. The term itself was coined in 1845 by journalist John L. O'Sullivan, who argued that it was America's God-given right, its destiny to expand across the entire North American continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Notice that word manifest, meaning obvious or clear. O'Sullivan wasn't presenting this as a debate. In his mind, expansion wasn't just desirable, it was inevitable, righteous, and divinely ordained. That combination of nationalism, religious conviction, and racial superiority made Manifest Destiny an extraordinarily powerful ideology, and an extraordinarily dangerous one. The three pillars of Manifest Destiny. To really understand this concept the way the AP exam expects you to, you need to see it resting on three interconnected legs. First, there was the belief in American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States was a uniquely virtuous nation, a democratic beacon meant to spread its values westward. Second, there was a heavy dose of racial ideology. Many Americans at the time genuinely believed that Anglo-Saxon Protestant settlers were racially superior to Native Americans, Mexicans, and other peoples of the West, and that this superiority justified displacement and conquest. Third, there was an economic hunger. Land meant farming. Farming meant wealth, and wealth meant power. These three pillars worked together and reinforced each other constantly. A common pitfall here is treating Manifest Destiny as purely idealistic or purely economic. The exam loves to test whether you understand that it was both a genuine belief system that also conveniently justified land grabs and disposition. Oregon, Texas, and the politics of expansion. Now let's ground this in the actual events of the 1840s, because the AP exam will absolutely test specific territorial acquisitions. The two biggest flashpoints are Texas and Oregon, and they're worth comparing side by side. Texas had been an independent republic since 1836, when American settlers who had moved there under Mexican invitation, mind you, revolted against Mexican invitation, revolted against Mexico and declared independence by 1844. Annexing Texas was a red-hot political issue. James K. Polk ran for president essentially on a Manifest Destiny platform, and his victory in 1844 sent a clear message. Americans wanted expansion. Texas was annexed in 1845, which directly provoked the Mexican-American War, 1848. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended that war and handed the U.S. an enormous chunk of territory. Present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. That's the Mexican cession, and you need to know that term cold. Oregon is a slightly different story. Here, the U.S. had a joint occupation agreement with Britain going back to 1818. Polk campaigned on the aggressive slogan 54-40 or fight. demanding all of the Oregon Territory up to the 54° 40 parallel. In practice, though, Polk compromised with Britain in 1846, settling the border at the 49th parallel, where it remains today between the U.S. and Canada. The AP exam loves to ask why Polk was willing to negotiate with Britain but went to war with Mexico. Think about it. Britain was a powerful military rival. Mexico was not. Power dynamics matter. Native Americans and the human cost of destiny. Here's where you absolutely cannot let the exam catch you being one-dimensional. Manifest destiny wasn't just about American ambition. It was about systematic destruction of indigenous peoples and cultures. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 had already set the precedent, but westward expansion in the 1840s, 1860s accelerated the dispossession of dozens of native nations across the Great Plains and Southwest. Native peoples were pushed onto reservations, their treaty rights repeatedly violated, and their ways of life deliberately undermined. The AP exam increasingly asks you to analyze this history from multiple perspectives. So practice framing manifest destiny not as progress, but as a contested process with real victims. Manifest destiny and the slavery crisis. Here's the connection that AP students most often miss, and it's crucial. Every new territory acquired through manifest destiny immediately reignited the question of whether slavery would be permitted there. The Wilmot Proviso of 1846 tried and failed to ban slavery from any land acquired from Mexico. That failure exposed just how deeply divisive westward expansion had become. Manifest destiny, in other words, didn't just expand the nation geographically, expanded the slavery debate to a breaking point that eventually led to the Civil War. If you remember nothing else, remember this chain: manifest destiny, new territories, slavery question, sectional crisis, Civil War. A good mnemonic for the key territorial moments: 2 Maypee, Texas, 1845, Oregon, 1846, Mexican Cession, 1848, and the Gadsden Purchase, 1853, which added a small strip of present-day southern Arizona and New Mexico for a potential southern railroad route. Wrapping up, manifest destiny was America telling itself a story about destiny, virtue, and superiority that justified extraordinary expansion and extraordinary understanding its ideology, its territorial consequences, and its connection to the coming slavery crisis will serve you well, not just on the AP exam, but in understanding how this era set the stage for the Civil War, which is exactly where we're headed next. Part 5.3, The Mexican-American War. Setting the stage, manifest destiny meets reality. All right, so picture this. It's the mid-S04E05s, and the United States is basically that ambitious neighbor who keeps eyeing the property next door. We've got this electric idea, manifest destiny, the belief that God or fate or some cosmic force had ordained that the United States would stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It sounds poetic, but make no mistake, manifest destiny wasn't just a philosophical daydream. It was a political justification with real consequences. And nowhere do those consequences hit harder than in the Mexican-American War. The AP exam loves this topic because it sits at the intersection of so many big themes: territorial expansion, sectionalism, race, and the agonizing slow burn toward the Civil War. So let's walk through it carefully. The road to war, Texas and the spark. The story really starts with Texas. After Texas won its independence from Mexico in 1836, it existed as its own republic for nearly a decade. The U.S. was hesitant to annex it because of two things. Mexico still considered Texas its territory. And here's the bigger issue: Texas would enter as a slave state, inflaming the already raw debate over slavery's expansion. But in 1844, James K.R. Polk won the presidency on an aggressive expansionist platform, and by 1845, Congress voted to annex Texas. Mexico was furious, but the real flashpoint was a border dispute. The U.S. claimed the Rio Grande as the southern boundary of Texas. Mexico insisted it was the Nueces River, about 150 miles to the north. Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to march troops into the disputed zone, essentially daring Mexico to fire first. When Mexican forces did engage American soldiers in April 1846, Polk went to Congress declaring that Mexico had shed American blood on American soil. Congress declared war. Here's your first AP pitfall. Many students remember this as a straightforward defensive war. It wasn't a freshman congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln famously challenged Polk to identify the exact spot where American blood was shed, arguing the administration had engineered the conflict. This is the spot resolutions, a minor but testable detail that shows you understand the war was deeply controversial from day one. The war itself and manifest destiny in action. The military conflict was relatively swift. American forces under Generals Taylor and Winfield Scott performed well, eventually capturing Mexico City in 1847. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 ended the war, and the terms were staggering. Mexico ceded roughly half its territory, what we now call California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado. And Wyoming, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million, which was essentially a fig leaf to make the land grab look like a purchase. Think of it as the world's most coercive real estate deal. The Wilmot Proviso, where the war becomes about slavery. Now here's where the exam really wants your attention. Almost immediately, while the war was still being fought, a Pennsylvania congressman named David Wilmot introduced the Wilmot Proviso in 1846. It proposed that slavery be banned from any territory acquired from Mexico. It passed the House, where northern free states had more power, but died in the Senate. Never became law, but that almost doesn't matter for your purposes. The Wilmot Proviso is crucial because it crystallized the sectional debate. Every congressman suddenly had to declare where they stood. Southerners saw it as a direct threat to their way of life. Northerners saw the expansion of slavery into new territories as a moral and economic outrage. The war over Mexican land almost immediately became a proxy war over the future of slavery in America. Think of the Wilmot Proviso as the match that didn't start the Civil War fire, but definitely showed how much dry wood was stacked up. The big picture connecting to sectionalism. A useful way to hold all of this in your head is what historians sometimes call the sectional tension spiral. Every major event from the late 1840s onward, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Bleeding Kansas, Dred Scott flows directly from the question the Mexican-American War reopened with full force. Will slavery expand into new territories? The war gave the U.S. enormous new land, and in doing so gave American politics an enormous new crisis. A mnemonic that helps students keep the treaty straight. It GH18 Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848. Simple, but it locks in the date and the treaty name together. One more common AP pitfall. Don't confuse the Mexican cession, land from the 1848 treaty, with the Gadsden Purchase of 1853, which was a smaller strip of land bought from Mexico specifically to build a southern transcontinental railroad route. They're related but distinct, and mixing them up on a free response question costs you points. Why it still matters. The Mexican-American War is one of those events that doesn't just belong to the 1840s. It reshaped the geography, politics, and soul of the nation. The land it brought in transformed the U.S. into a continental power. The controversy it stirred over slavery pushed the country closer to its breaking point. And the political fault lines it exposed between expansionists and critics, between slave and free states, are precisely the fault lines that will crack wide open in the 1850s and 1860s. As we move into the next section, you'll see how the land won from Mexico made the question of slavery's expansion not just urgent but unavoidable, setting the stage for the Compromise of 1850 and the increasingly desperate attempts to hold the Union together. Part 5.4, The Compromise of 1850. The nation on the brink. Imagine you and your roommates have one last slice of pizza, and absolutely everyone has a different passionate opinion about who deserves it. Now, multiply that by 30 million people. Add the moral weight of human enslavement. Throw in a war's worth of newly acquired territory, and you've got the United States in 1850. The Mexican-American War had just handed the country an enormous prize, roughly half of Mexico's territory. And the instant that land came into the picture, The question that had been simmering since the founding burst back to a full dangerous boil: would slavery expand into the new territories, or wouldn't it? The setup: why 1850 was a pressure cooker. To understand the Compromise of 1850, you first need to remember what came just before it. In 1846, Pennsylvania Congressman David Wilmot proposed what became known as the Wilmot Proviso, which would have banned slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico, passed the House twice, and died in the Senate twice, and that split House versus Senate, free state versus slave state. Basically tells you everything about how divided the country already was. Meanwhile, California had just experienced the gold rush and was ready to enter the Union as a free state. That was the match dropped into a room full of gunpowder, because admitting California would permanently break the delicate sectional balance, 16 free states to 15 slave states that had kept the peace since the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Henry Clay's Grand Bargain. Enter Henry Clay, the 73-year-old senator from Kentucky who had already brokered 2 major national compromises and was determined to save the Union one more time. Clay put together an omnibus bill. Think of it as a legislative combo meal, bundling something for everyone that would theoretically satisfy both the North and the South enough to pull the country back from the edge. Here's what the deal looked like. California would enter the Union as a free state, which the North wanted. The remaining territories acquired from Mexico, New Mexico and Utah, would be organized under the principle of popular sovereignty, meaning the settlers themselves would vote on whether to allow slavery, which punted the decision and gave the South hope. Texas, which had been claiming enormous chunks of what is now New Mexico, would surrender those land claims in exchange for the federal government, assuming its $10 million debt. Washington, D.C. would end the domestic slave trade. Note that word carefully. Trade, not slavery itself, which was a symbolic gesture to Northern anti-slavery sentiment. And most consequentially, the federal government would pass a strengthened Fugitive Slave Act, requiring Northerners to actively assist in the capture and return of escaped enslaved people. The Fugitive Slave Act, the Compromise's fatal flaw. This last provision is the one the AP exam loves to test, and for good reason. It backfired spectacularly. The new Fugitive Slave Act didn't just allow slave catchers to operate in the North. It compelled ordinary Northern citizens to participate. Federal commissioners who handled these cases were paid $10 if they ruled a person was an escaped slave, and only $5 if they ruled the person free. You don't have to be a cynic to see the problem there. Northerners who had been largely indifferent to slavery now had it literally show up at their door. Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, partly as a direct response to what she saw around her, and the book sold 300,000 copies in its first year. The Fugitive Slave Act didn't quiet the slavery debate. It nationalized it. How the compromise actually passed. Here's an AP pitfall worth noting. The Compromise of 1850 did not pass as Clay's original omnibus bill. Clay's big package actually failed. It was Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, young, scrappy, and politically savvy, who saved it by breaking the bill into separate pieces and passing each one individually. Assembling different coalitions for each vote, President Millard Fillmore, who had replaced the recently deceased Zachary Taylor, Taylor had opposed the compromise, signed each bill into law. So when you see a question about who gets credit for passing the compromise, remember, Clay proposed it, Douglas passed it, Fillmore signed it. The deeper significance. A good mnemonic for the 5 components is EVIESH, California free, Texas paid, Utah, New Mexico vote, D.C. No trade, fugitives caught. Not the catchiest phrase, but it maps each piece directly. More importantly, understand what the Compromise of 1850 represents thematically. It was the last time a grand sectional bargain would actually work. And even then, work is generous. It bought roughly a decade of uneasy quiet. The popular sovereignty principle it introduced would come back to haunt the nation when Stephen Douglas applied it to already settled territory in the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, igniting the violent chaos known as Bleeding Kansas and effectively destroying the second-party system. The Compromise of 1850 is best understood not as a solution, but as a delay, a finger in a cracking dam. Reveals that by mid-century, the contradictions at the heart of American democracy had grown too large for any political deal to permanently contain. With that fault line now clearly drawn, we'll move into Section 5.5 and watch it finally tear open with the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the collapse of the political order it triggered. Part 5.5 Sectional Conflict. Regional differences. The nation pulling in two directions. Imagine you and your roommate share an apartment, but one of you wants to keep the heat blasting at 80 degrees and the other wants the windows open in January. Now multiply that disagreement by millions of people, billions of dollars, and a question of basic human freedom. And you're starting to understand the sectional conflict tearing the United States apart in the mid-19th century. By the 1840s and 1850s, the North and South weren't just different regions. They were operating on fundamentally different economic models, and those models were increasingly incompatible. The North had industrialized rapidly cities like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia hummed with textile mills, railroads, and wage labor. Northern workers, many of them recent immigrants from Ireland and Germany, sold their labor for wages, moved between jobs, and lived in a world defined by what historians call a free labor ideology. The idea was simple and powerful. Any man, through hard work, could climb the economic ladder. Freedom meant the freedom to work, to move, to improve yourself. Northern politicians, especially the newly formed Republican Party, wrapped this ideology in almost religious language. To them, slavery wasn't just morally wrong. It was an economic threat. If slavery spread westward into new territories, it would crowd out free white workers and corrupt the promise of upward mobility. The Southern economy and the defense of slavery. Now flip to the South. The Southern economy ran on cotton, and cotton ran on enslaved labor. After Eli Whitney's cotton gin transformed the industry in the late 1700s, cotton became spectacularly profitable, and the demand for enslaved people exploded. By 1860, there were nearly 4 million enslaved people in the South, and the total value of enslaved human beings exceeded the value of all railroads and factories in the entire country combined. Let that sink in for a moment. Slavery wasn't a dying institution limping toward an inevitable end. It was booming. Southern planters and politicians developed an increasingly aggressive defense of slavery, moving from calling it a necessary evil in the early republic to celebrating it as a positive good by the 1840s. Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina led this charge, arguing that slavery was the foundation of Southern civilization and that the federal government had no right to interfere with it. Southern writers compared the condition of enslaved people favorably, absurdly, cruelly, to the lives of Northern factory workers, calling the latter wage slaves. This was an ideological battle, and both sides were fighting hard. Here's a common AP pitfall worth flagging. Don't assume the sectional conflict was simply North good, South bad in a moralistic cartoon sense. The AP exam wants you to understand the complexity. Many Northerners were deeply racist and had no interest in racial equality. They just didn't want slavery competing with their free labor system. The conflict was as much economic and political as it was moral, even if the moral dimension was always present underneath. The West as the flashpoint. So why did everything explode when it did? The answer is the West. As long as the question of slavery was confined to existing states, an uneasy truce was possible. But the Mexican-American War of 1846 and 1848 handed the United States an enormous chunk of new territory and immediately forced the question, would slavery expand into these new lands? Think of the Western territories as a blank canvas that both the North and South desperately wanted to paint their own color. The Wilmot Proviso, proposed in 1846, tried to ban slavery from any territory acquired from Mexico. It passed the House twice and died in the Senate, revealing exactly how the fault line ran. The Compromise of 1850 tried to patch things together with a series of deals, most notoriously the Fugitive Slave Act, which required Northerners to assist in capturing and returning escaped enslaved people. That provision backfired spectacularly. It dragged Northerners directly into the machinery of slavery and radicalized people who had previously stayed quiet. The Kansas-Nebraska Act and the point of no return. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 was arguably the point of no return. Architect Stephen Douglas wanted to build a transcontinental railroad through Chicago, which required organizing the Nebraska Territory. To win Southern votes, he proposed repealing the Missouri Compromise line of 1820, the agreement that had kept slavery south of 36 degrees 30 and replacing it with popular sovereignty, letting settlers of each territory vote on whether to allow slavery. The result was Bleeding Kansas, a literal guerrilla war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. It wasn't a metaphor. People were dying in Kansas over this question. A useful mnemonic for remembering the key legislative moments. At WCK, at Wilmot, supremacy of 1850. When a Republican, Abraham Lincoln, won the presidency in 1860 without a single Southern electoral vote, Southern states concluded the political system could no longer protect their interests. The logic of secession followed. What you're watching in this period is the slow-motion collapse of every compromise mechanism the founders had built into the system, and the recognition on both sides that the nation's future direction couldn't be decided at a negotiating table anymore. Next, we'll examine how these regional tensions exploded into the Civil War itself, and how the conflict reshaped American politics, society, and identity from the ground up. Part 5.6, Failure of Compromise. The breaking point. Imagine you and a roommate had been arguing for years about the thermostat. You negotiate, you compromise, you write little agreements on sticky notes, but eventually one of you turns the heat all the way up and the other one moves out. That's essentially what happened to the United States between the 1820s and 1860. The country tried so many compromises over slavery that historians actually have a term for this era. The era of sectional crisis, and by the 1850s, the sticky notes just weren't working anymore. The key insight the AP exam wants you to walk away with is this. Compromise didn't fail because politicians were bad at negotiating. It failed because the underlying conflict, slavery's expansion into new territories, was fundamentally irreconcilable. One side needed slavery to grow to survive economically and politically. The other side viewed its expansion as a moral and political catastrophe. You cannot split that difference forever. The compromises that tried and failed. You've already seen the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which drew that famous 36 degrees 30 in line across the Louisiana Territory and kept an uneasy peace for about 3 decades. But the Mexican-American War blew that framework apart. Suddenly, the U.S. had an enormous new chunk of land, thanks to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, and nobody agreed on what to do with it. Enter the Compromise of 1850, which was really less of a compromise and more of a bundle of 5 separate deals duct taped together by Henry Clay and ultimately shepherded through Congress by Stephen Douglas. California came in as a free state. The Southwest Territories got popular sovereignty, meaning the settlers would vote on slavery. The slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C. And here's the part that outraged Northerners. The Fugitive Slave Act was dramatically strengthened. This new law required Northern citizens to actively assist in capturing and returning escaped enslaved people. That felt like slavery reaching into their living rooms. For many Northerners, this wasn't compromise. It was capitulation. A common AP pitfall here is confusing banning the slave trade in D.C. with banning slavery in D.C. The compromise banned the buying and selling of enslaved people in the capital, but people could still legally own enslaved people there. That's a critical distinction. Popular sovereignty, a great idea that exploded. The concept of popular sovereignty sounds almost democratic, right? Let the people of a territory decide for themselves. Stephen Douglas loved it because it let politicians dodge the question, but in practice, it was a powder keg. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, Astrias, applied popular sovereignty to territories north of the 36-degree 30 line, essentially repealing the Missouri Compromise. Kansas in particular became a war zone. Pro-slavery settlers poured in from Missouri. Anti-slavery settlers flooded in from the north. Both sides held rival elections, set up rival governments, and eventually started shooting each other. Bleeding Kansas wasn't a metaphor, it was a preview of the Civil War, a small-scale rehearsal of violence on plains. Here's your mnemonic for the aftermath of Kansas-Nebraska. Kansas kills compromise. The act destroyed the Whig Party, which couldn't agree on a response, gave birth to the new Republican Party founded in 1854, specifically around opposing slavery's expansion, and radicalized public opinion on both sides. The Dred Scott decision. The courts make it worse. If you thought Congress had made a mess, the Supreme Court stepped in to make things worse. In Dred Scott v. Sanford, 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney delivered a ruling that had 3 seismic effects. First, he declared that Scott, an enslaved man who had lived in free territories, had no right to sue because black Americans, free or enslaved, were not citizens. Second, the ruling said Congress had never had the constitutional authority to ban slavery in any territory, which meant the Missouri Compromise had been unconstitutional all along. Third, it implied that popular sovereignty itself was meaningless. Territories couldn't ban slavery either. Think of the Dred Scott decision as pouring gasoline on the fire. It told the North that there was no legal pathway to contain slavery, not Congress, not territorial votes, nothing. It electrified the Republican Party and handed Abraham Lincoln his most powerful campaign argument. John Brown and the Point of No Return by 1859. The country was so polarized that a violent abolitionist raid could crack the nation in half, as John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was a failed attempt to trigger a slave rebellion by seizing a federal arsenal. Brown was quickly captured and executed, but the reaction told everything. The North viewed Brown as a tragic martyr. The South viewed Northern sympathy for Brown as proof that the North wanted to incite racial warfare against them. Trust between the sections had completely collapsed. When you see AP questions about this period, watch for the cause and effect chain. Each solution, the Compromise of 1850 popular sovereignty, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, actually generated more conflict, not less. That's the through line of 5.6. Compromise didn't fail in a single dramatic moment, died by 1,000 cuts, each one deepening the wound. With the nation teetering on the edge, the election of 1860 would be the final push, which takes us directly into the causes and outbreak of the Civil War itself. Part 5.7 Election of 1860 and Secession. The perfect storm. Imagine you've been watching a slow-motion car crash for about 40 years. You can see it coming. Everyone can see it coming. And yet somehow no one manages to get out of the way in time. That's essentially what the election of 1860 was. The final catastrophic collision of every tension that had been building in American political life since the Missouri Compromise. By the time the votes were counted, the Union was already cracking at the seams, and within months it would shatter entirely. To understand why this election mattered so much, you need to remember where things stood going in. The Democratic Party, once the dominant national force under Andrew Jackson, had completely collapsed under the weight of the slavery debate. At their 1860 convention in Charleston, Southern Democrats stormed out when the party refused to include an explicit federal guarantee of slavery in the territories. They reconvened and nominated their own candidate, John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, on a pro-slavery platform. The remaining Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas, the champion of popular sovereignty, the man who had authored the Kansas-Nebraska Act and arguably lit the fuse on this whole powder keg. Meanwhile, a new group called the Constitutional Union Party nominated John Bell of Tennessee, essentially running on a platform of, please, everyone just calm down. And then there were the Republicans, who nominated a relatively unknown one-term congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. 4 candidates, 1 catastrophe. Here's the key thing AP students get wrong about this election. Lincoln did not win because he was popular across the country. He won because the opposition was fractured into 3 pieces. Lincoln's name didn't even appear on the ballot in most southern states. He won entirely on the strength of northern free state votes. And in the Electoral College, that was enough. He captured 180 electoral votes, a majority without winning a single southern state. Think of it like a group project where 3 members are arguing about how to split the workload, and the 4th person quietly finishes the whole thing while they're distracted. This matters enormously for the AP exam. The election of 1860 demonstrated just how geographically divided the nation had become. It wasn't simply a two-sided argument anymore. It was a nation where national politics had essentially ceased to function. When a candidate could win the presidency without competing in half the country, the political bonds holding the Union together had already frayed past the point of easy repair. Secession, not a surprise, but still a crisis. South Carolina didn't wait around. By December 1860, before Lincoln had even taken office, the state had voted to secede, citing Lincoln's election as a direct threat to the institution of slavery. By February 1861, 6 more Deep South states had followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Together they formed the Confederate States of America with Jefferson Davis as their president. Common AP pitfall here is assuming secession and the Civil War started simultaneously. They didn't. Lincoln didn't take office until March 4, 1861, and Fort Sumter wasn't fired upon until April. There were several agonizing months in between where people genuinely debated whether the Union could still be saved. What justified secession in Southern minds? Their own declarations of secession make it unmistakably clear the preservation of slavery was the central cause. Mississippi's declaration states it plainly. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Don't let anyone on the AP exam convince you this was primarily about tariffs or states' rights in the abstract. The states' right they were defending was specifically their right to hold enslaved people. Buchanan's paralysis and the Crittenden Compromise. While all this was happening, lame duck President James Buchanan sat in the White House doing essentially nothing. He declared secession illegal, but also claimed he had no constitutional authority to stop it, a position that satisfied absolutely no one. It's a bit like a referee declaring a foul and then walking off the field. Congress attempted one last-ditch effort with the Crittenden Compromise proposed by Kentucky Senator John Crittenden, which would have permanently protected slavery south of the 36 degrees. 30 Mine Line, and even made the provision unamendable. Lincoln quietly killed it, refusing to support any measure that would allow slavery's expansion for him. And for the Republican platform, that line was non-negotiable. The AP takeaways. A few mnemonics and connections worth locking in before your exam. Remember, BDBL AP for the 4 1860 candidates. EBL D EDV Ogles Breckenridge. Is Lincoln going from most conservative to most threatening in Southern eyes? Remember that Lincoln won the Electoral College decisively despite getting roughly 40% of the popular vote because the split opposition handed him every free state. And remember the sequence: election in November. Secession begins in December. Confederary Lincoln inaugurated in March. Fort Sumter in April. The AP loves testing whether you can keep that timeline straight. The deeper concept to carry forward is that the election of 1860 didn't cause disunion. It revealed disunion that already existed. The political system had been masking a fundamental incompatibility for decades, and now the mask was off. With the Confederacy formed and Lincoln heading to Washington, the question was no longer whether conflict was coming. It was what kind of conflict it would be. And that takes us directly into the outbreak and early years of the Civil War. Part 5.8, Military Conflict in the Civil War. Setting the stage. 2 sides, 2 strategies. All right, let's talk about the Civil War. Not just as a list of battles you need to memorize, but as a story of 2 very different nations trying to survive. Because here's the thing. When the war began in April 1861 with the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter, most people on both sides thought it would be over in a few months. A quick, decisive fight, and someone goes home. What they got, instead, was 4 years of industrialized slaughter that fundamentally remade the country. So what happened? Strategy, resources, and a war that kept changing its own rules. Start with the fundamental asymmetry. The Union had roughly 22 million people versus the Confederacy's 9 million. And about 3.5 million of those Confederates were enslaved people who were not going to be fighting for the system that enslaved them. The Union had roughly 90% of the nation's industrial capacity, most of the railroads, and a functioning navy. On paper, this looks like a lopsided contest, but the Confederacy had a crucial strategic advantage. They didn't need to conquer the North. They just needed to survive long enough for Northern public opinion to collapse. Think of it like a home team playing keep away. You don't have to score more points. You just have to run out the clock. The Anaconda Plan and Union Strategy. The Union's initial strategy, proposed by General Winfield Scott, was called the Anaconda Plan, and yes, it's named after the snake. The idea was to squeeze the Confederacy into submission by blockading southern ports, controlling the Mississippi River to split the Confederacy in two, and then systematically tightening the grip. AP students sometimes underestimate this plan, dismissing it as too slow. But here's your key insight. The Anaconda Plan was largely correct. The Union naval blockade, while imperfect early on, increasingly strangled Confederate trade and supply lines as the war progressed. Controlling the Mississippi, achieved with Grant's capture of Vicksburg in July 1863, literally cut the Confederacy in half. Don't overlook the logistical and economic dimensions of this war. Technology, tactics, and terrible casualties. Here's where you need to think like a military historian for a moment. The Civil War sits at a brutal technological crossroads. Commanders were still using Napoleonic tactics, massed infantry charges, attacking in formation, but the weapons had dramatically improved. The old rifled musket replaced the smoothbore musket and could accurately kill at 3 to 4 times the distance. The results? Frontal assaults that might have worked in 1815 became meat grinders by 1863. Battles like Antietam, September 1862, the single bloodiest day in American military history with roughly 23,000 casualties, and Gettysburg, July 1863, reflect this disconnect between old tactics and new technology. The AP exam loves this concept, the idea that the Civil War's staggering death toll, roughly 620,000 to 750,000 soldiers, was partly a product of this tactical lag. Key turning points you must know. The AP exam is going to test you on turning points, so let's lock in 3. Antietam missed it. 1862 is crucial. Not just militarily, it was a Union strategic victory that gave Lincoln the political cover he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863. This transformed the war's purpose. Now the Union was explicitly fighting to end slavery, which had the enormous effect of discouraging Britain and France from formally recognizing or aiding the Confederacy. European nations weren't going to align themselves with a pro-slavery government when their own working classes were morally opposed. The Emancipation Proclamation is one of those hinge moments where military conflict and political purpose become inseparable. That's exactly what the AP wants you to see. Gettysburg and Vicksburg in July 1863 form your second turning point. Gettysburg ended the Confederate threat of northern invasion. Vicksburg gave the Union control of the Mississippi. Together, they shifted momentum decisively. Your third turning point is F.H. Sherman's March to the Sea in 1864, which introduced the concept of total war, deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure, crops, and morale to break the Confederate will to fight. This is not the same as earlier warfare. And the AP exam will ask you to identify this shift. Sherman wasn't just fighting armies. He was dismantling the Southern economy and psychology of resistance. African American soldiers and the war's expanding meaning. Don't sleep on this section. After the Emancipation Proclamation, approximately 80,000 African Americans SG is served in the Union Army as part of the United States Colored Troops, USCT. This is enormously significant both militarily and symbolically. Their service directly challenged the racial logic of the Confederacy and helped redefine what the war was about. The 54th Massachusetts Infantry Estuas, whose assault on Fort Wagner, you should know, became a powerful symbol of Black courage and patriotism. AP pitfall alert: students sometimes treat Black military service as a footnote. It isn't. It's central to understanding both the military outcome and the post-war debates over citizenship and Reconstruction. Common AP pitfalls. 2 mistakes students make constantly. First, confusing the political significance of battles with their military significance. Antietam was tactically inconclusive but politically transformative. Second, assuming the Confederacy was doomed from day one. It wasn't, and the near collapse of Northern morale in the summer of 1864, before Sherman's capture of Atlanta, shows how close things actually came. The Civil War's military story is ultimately inseparable from its political and social story, and that's exactly the thread we'll pick up as we move into the transformation of the nation that followed in our look at Reconstruction. Part 5.9, Government Policies During the Civil War. Setting the stage. Imagine you're running a country while half of it is literally trying to leave. You've got an army to fund, a war to fight, and a nervous public wondering if the whole experiment called the United States is about to collapse. That's exactly the pressure cooker Abraham Lincoln and Congress were sitting in from 1861 to 1865. And here's the fascinating part. The policies they pushed through during this crisis didn't just win a war. They fundamentally reshaped the relationship between the federal government and American life. Let's walk through the big ones. Financing the war. Money makes the cannons fire. The Union faced an immediate, unglamorous problem. Wars are absurdly expensive. To pay for it all, Congress reached for three major tools. First, the Revenue Act of 1861 established the first federal income tax in American history, a flat 3% on incomes over $800. Think of it as the government saying, if you're doing well enough to earn real money, you're going to help pay for this war. It was later replaced by a more graduated system, which is a direct ancestor of the tax structure you file under today. Second, Congress authorized the printing of paper currency, the famous greenbacks, through the Legal Tender Act of 1862. These weren't backed by gold or silver, they were backed by the government's promise. Inflation followed, naturally. This is your classic AP connection. When money supply increases without a corresponding increase in goods and services, prices rise. The greenbacks worked well enough to keep the Union solvent, but they were controversial, and their constitutional legitimacy was actually debated in courts for years afterward. Third, the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864 created a system of federally chartered banks and a uniform national currency. Before this, individual state banks printed their own money. Imagine going shopping and having to figure out if the bill in your hand from some random Ohio bank was actually worth anything. The National Banking Act brought order to that chaos and centralized financial power in Washington. This is a huge deal on the AP exam because it represents a massive expansion of federal authority over economic life. The Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act, building a nation mid-war. Here's something that surprises students every time. While the war raged, Congress also passed some of the most transformative peacetime legislation in American history. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres of public land, essentially for free, to any citizen who would settle and farm it for 5 years. The goal was to populate the West, create loyal free labor farmers, and undercut the Southern plantation model. It's the government saying, go West, build something, and become part of our vision for America. Millions eventually did. The Pacific Railway Act of 1862 authorized the construction of a transcontinental railroad with massive federal land grants and loans to the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroad companies. The AP exam loves this because it illustrates how war-era necessity accelerated economic integration. Connected nation was harder to divide. The draft and civil liberties, the cost of total war. The Union also instituted the first federal military draft in American history through the Conscription Act of 1863. Here's your memorable detail. Wealthy men could pay a $300 commutation fee to avoid service. $300 was several months' wages for a working-class man. Draft riots exploded in New York City in July 1863, with mobs targeting black residents in a horrifying display of class and racial resentment tangled together. The AP exam often asks you to connect the draft to questions of inequality and social tension. Lincoln also suspended habeas corpus in some areas, allowing the military to detain civilians without trial. The Supreme Court case, Ex parte Milligan, 1866, later ruled this unconstitutional, where civilian courts were still functioning. A reminder that even emergency powers have limits. This is a perennial AP pitfall. Students often assume Lincoln acted entirely unchecked. He didn't, and the courts eventually pushed back. The Moral Land Grant Act, Education as Federal Policy. Don't overlook the Moral Land Grant Act of 1862. which gave states federal land to sell in order to fund public colleges focused on agriculture and engineering. Schools like Cornell, MIT, and the University of Illinois trace their roots here. This represents the federal government investing in human capital and practical education, another expansion of Washington's role in everyday American life that the AP exam frequently tests. The big picture, federal power expands. Here's your unifying theme, and write this down, because AP essays love it. The Civil War dramatically expanded the size, scope, and power of the federal government. The income tax, national banking system, paper currency, land grants, the draft, the Transcontinental Railroad, all of these shifted the center of gravity away from states and toward Washington. The war didn't just preserve the Union geographically, it transformed what the Union was. A helpful mnemonic for the major acts is after H, E, P, and M, Homestead, Pacific Railway, national banking, moral four pillars of wartime transformation. As monumental as these economic and institutional changes were, the war simultaneously forced a reckoning with the most fundamental question in American life, the future of slavery, which brings us directly into the moral and political transformation of emancipation. Part 5.1 Joe, Reconstruction. The broken nation and the question of repair. Imagine you've just finished a massive renovation on a house, except the renovation involved tearing the house halfway down first. Now comes the harder question. How do you rebuild? Who decides the design? And what happens to the people who lived there before? That's essentially the puzzle facing the United States after the Civil War. Reconstruction, running roughly from 1865 to SIP 2877 is one of the most consequential and heartbreaking chapters in American history, and the AP exam loves every corner of it. Presidential versus congressional Reconstruction. The first thing you need to lock in is the fundamental tension between two competing visions of Reconstruction. Lincoln's 10% plan is relatively lenient. Once 10% of a southern state's voters swore loyalty to the Union, the state could rejoin and form a new government. Think of it as a forgive and mostly forget approach. Congress pushed back hard with the Eve Davis Bill of 1864, which demanded a majority of voters swear loyalty and required stronger protections for formerly enslaved people. Lincoln pocket vetoed it, and the fight was on. After Lincoln's assassination, Andrew Johnson took a similarly lenient approach, arguably even more so. He rapidly restored southern states, allowed former Confederates back into power, and showed little interest in protecting black Southerners. Congress, dominated by every whit radical Republicans, was furious. They believed Johnson was letting the South win the peace after losing the war. This clash escalated until Congress impeached Johnson in 1868. He survived by a single Senate vote, but his power was effectively broken. The Reconstruction Amendments, your AP anchor. You absolutely must know the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment cold. Think of them as a three-step staircase. The 13th, 1865, abolished slavery. The 14th, 1868, granted citizenship and equal protection under the law. This is the amendment that does enormous legal work throughout all of U.S. history. So flag it mentally. The 15th, 1770, prohibited denying the vote based on race. Together, these represent a revolutionary reimagining of federal power and civil rights. A common AP pitfall. Students forget that the 15th Amendment did not guarantee women's suffrage, which caused a significant rift in the reform movement between suffragists and abolitionists. The brief flowering of black political life. Here's something the AP wants you to appreciate. Reconstruction wasn't just tragedy from start to finish. There was a genuine, remarkable period of black political participation. The A. Freedmen's Bureau, established in 1865, provided food, education, and legal assistance to formerly enslaved people and poor white Southerners. Black men voted in large numbers, held public office, and built institutions. Figures like Hiram Revels at A and Blanche Bosworth served in the U.S. Senate. Black churches, schools, and communities flourished. This moment matters. It shows what was possible, which makes what followed even more significant. the unraveling redemption and the end of Reconstruction. Southern whites who opposed Reconstruction organized systematically to dismantle it. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terrorism, murders, beatings, and intimidation to suppress black voting and keep Republicans from holding power. Congress passed the Enforcement Acts 1871 to combat this violence. And for a moment, federal action actually worked. But Northern political will was fading. The other liberal Republicans of 1872 wanted to move past Reconstruction. The Panic of 1873 shifted attention to economic concerns. Gradually, federal troops withdrew, and Southern Democrats, calling themselves redeemers, took back control of state governments. The Overcompromise of 1877 is your official end date for Reconstruction. After the disputed 1876 election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden, a backroom deal gave Hayes the presidency in exchange for withdrawing the last federal troops from the South. With no federal protection, the brief era of black civil rights collapsed. What followed were black codes, sharecropping systems that kept black families in cycles of debt, and eventually Jim Crow segregation, all of which the AP will connect forward into later periods. The big picture AP argument. A key interpretive point the AP loves to test. Reconstruction failed not because it was too radical, but largely because the federal government lacked the sustained political will to enforce it. The 14th and 15th Amendments existed on paper, but went largely unenforced for nearly a century. This is a classic example of the gap between legal change and lived reality, a theme that runs from Reconstruction straight through to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. A useful mnemonic for the Reconstruction Amendments: freedom, citizenship, voting, 13, 14, 15 asteries in that logical order. Each builds on the last, just like the political struggle itself. One more pitfall to avoid: don't characterize Reconstruction as simply a Northern imposition on a helpless South. Black Southerners were active, creative agents in shaping this period. They fought for their rights, built communities, and demanded the promises of the Constitution be honored. The AP rewards responses that center their agency, with Reconstruction's collapse setting the stage for decades of racial oppression and the economic transformation of the Gilded Age. We're ready to step into the turbulent world of industrialization and its sweeping consequences for American society. Part 5.1.1 Failure of Reconstruction. The promise that wasn't kept. Imagine you spend 4 brutal years rebuilding a house after a fire, hauling lumber, laying foundations, doing the hard work, and then, just before you finish, everyone agrees to walk away and let the half-built structure collapse. That's essentially what happened to Reconstruction. The period from 1865 to 1877 was America's most ambitious attempt to redefine citizenship and equality, and its failure wasn't an accident. It was a choice made by politicians, courts, and an exhausted public that would echo for the next 100 years. Let's make sure you understand why it failed, because the AP exam doesn't just want you to know that it ended. It wants you to understand the forces that dismantled it. Political exhaustion and the compromise of 1877. By the mid-1870s, the North was tired of sending federal troops south, tired of corruption scandals. Grant's administration was drowning in them, and tired of the whole messy business of remaking Southern society. When the disputed presidential election of 1876 put Republican Rutherford B. Hayes against Democrat Samuel Tilden, Congress needed a deal. The Compromise of 1877 resolved it by awarding Hayes the presidency in exchange for withdrawing the last federal troops from the South. Think of it as the federal government hanging up the closed for business sign on Reconstruction. Without those troops, the enforcement mechanisms that had protected black civil and political rights simply evaporated. Here's your AP pitfall alert. Students often say Reconstruction just ended in 1877, but you need to know why that date matters. The withdrawal of troops wasn't just symbolic, it was the physical removal of the only force keeping Southern state governments from rolling back black rights. Make that connection explicit in your essays. The redeemers and the rollback. Once federal oversight retreated, Southern Democrats, calling themselves redeemers, moved swiftly to dismantle everything Reconstruction had built. They used poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and outright violence through groups like the Ku Klux Klan and the White League to strip black men of the vote they'd gained under the 15th Amendment. This system of racial disenfranchisement would harden into Jim Crow by the 1890s. But its roots are planted right here in the failures of the 1870s. A good mnemonic to remember the disenfranchisement tools. Please let grandfather vote, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, violence. These four mechanisms work together as a kind of legal and extra-legal fence around black political participation. The courts pull the rug out. The Supreme Court also did enormous damage to Reconstruction's legal framework. In the Slaughterhouse cases, 1873, the court narrowly interpreted the 14th Amendment, essentially ruling that most civil rights protections still fell under state rather than federal jurisdiction, which was precisely the problem Reconstruction was trying to fix. Then in United States v. Cruikshank 1876, the court ruled that the federal government couldn't prosecute private individuals as opposed to state actors for civil rights violations. This gutted the enforcement acts that had been used to prosecute Klan violence. Imagine passing a law against a crime and then watching the court say, sure, but you can't actually enforce it. That's the practical impact of these decisions. The AP exam loves to ask about the role of the Supreme Court in undermining Reconstruction. So know these cases and what they limited. Economic foundations that were never built. Here's something students often overlook. Reconstruction also failed because it never addressed the economic reality of formerly enslaved people. The famous promise of 40 acres and a mule, a reference to General Sherman's Special Field Order, No. 15, was revoked by President Andrew Johnson almost immediately after Lincoln's assassination. Without land ownership, black Southerners had no economic independence. They were forced into sharecropping arrangements that kept them tied to the same land, the same planters, and the same cycles of debt they'd known under slavery. Political rights mean very little when economic survival depends on the goodwill of the people who want to take those rights away. This is a critical structural failure of Reconstruction that the AP expects you to understand as more than just a side note. Why it matters and what you need to say on the exam. The failure of Reconstruction is a story about what happens when reform is incomplete, when legal change outpaces social and economic change, and when political will runs dry. For the AP exam, you need to be able to argue causation here. Was it more the political decisions, compromise of 1877, the judicial rollback, Cruikshank Slaughterhouse, the economic abandonment, no land redistribution, or the violent resistance of Southern whites? The best essays won't pick just one. They'll argue these forces reinforced each other, that violence suppressed the vote, that courts gave that violence cover, that economic dependence made resistance harder, and that a tired federal government looked away from all of it. Reconstruction's failure wasn't inevitable. It was a series of decisions, and the AP wants you to analyze who made them and why. Keep that analytical lens ready, because up next, we'll see how the seeds planted in this era bloom into the Gilded Age's inequality and the long unfinished struggle for civil rights. Part 5.112, Comparison in Period 5. Setting the stage. Why comparison matters. All right, let's talk about one of the most powerful thinking tools the AP exam is going to ask you to use, comparison. Period 5, spanning 1844 to 1877, is absolutely packed with transformative events. Westward expansion, the Civil War, Reconstruction. But here's the thing. The exam doesn't just want you to know what happened. It wants you to see how different groups, regions, and ideas relate to each other across the same era. Think of it like a split-screen movie. Two storylines are running simultaneously, and your job is to notice where they mirror each other and where they diverge. The core comparison: reform, movements, and sectionalism. One of the richest comparisons you can make in Period 5 is between the reform impulse of the antebellum era and the fracturing of national unity. During the 1840s and 1850s, reformers, abolitionists, women's rights advocates, temperance crusaders were all animated by the same basic belief: American society could be perfected. They shared an optimistic, almost evangelical energy. The Seneca Falls Convention of 1848. and William Lloyd Garrison's fiery abolitionism both drew from the same well of moral urgency. But here's the twist that the AP loves to test. While reformers were preaching unity and moral progress nationally, the political system was doing the exact opposite, fracturing along sectional lines. The Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, bleeding Kansas. These events show a nation pulling itself apart. So you've got two simultaneous trends: moral reform pushing toward a more perfect union, and political sectionalism pulling it to pieces. Don't forget that tension. It's going to show up in your DBQ or LEQ. North versus South, an economic and social mirror. A classic comparison the AP expects you to master is the North-South divide, not just politically, but economically and socially. Think of the North and South as two siblings raised in the same house, but who developed completely different values. The North industrialized rapidly after 1820, building a wage labor economy fueled by immigration, factories, and railroads. By the 1850s, Northern identity was increasingly tied to free labor ideology, the idea that any hardworking man could rise through honest work. The South, meanwhile, doubled down on a plantation economy dependent on enslaved labor. Southern elites constructed elaborate pro-slavery arguments, from John C. Calhoun's states' rights theory to the pseudo-scientific claims you see in figures like George Fitzhugh. Here's a common AP pitfall. Students assume the South was simply backwards. Don't fall into that trap. The South had a coherent, internally consistent worldview. It was just one that rested on a brutal foundation of human bondage. The exam rewards nuance. Reconstruction, comparing visions of the post-war South. Now fast forward to Reconstruction, and the comparison game gets even more interesting. You need to be able to compare the different visions of how to rebuild the South. Lincoln's 10% plan was relatively lenient. Get 10% of a state's voters to swear loyalty. And you're back in the Union. The radical Republicans, led by figures like Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, thought that was far too easy. Their vision, embodied in the Wade-Davis Bill and later the Reconstruction Acts, demanded a more fundamental transformation of Southern society. Here's a great analogy. Imagine rebuilding a house after a fire. Lincoln wanted to patch it up quickly and move people back in. The radicals wanted to tear down the damaged foundation and rebuild from scratch. Neither approach was crazy. They just reflected genuinely different ideas about how deep the rot went. Then there's the comparison between African American experiences during Reconstruction. Freed people weren't passive recipients of policy, they were active agents. The establishment of black churches, schools, and political participation during Reconstruction represents one of the most remarkable grassroots democratic movements in American history. Compare that to the simultaneous rise of groups like the Ku Klux Klan. And you see period 5's defining tension in sharp relief, extraordinary progress and violent backlash existing side by side. A mnemonic to lock it in. Here's a memory trick for the big comparisons in period 5 in reform, nation splitting, slavery's expansion, and emancipation's limits. Those four forces are constantly in dialogue with each other across this entire period. When you see a document or prompt on the exam, ask yourself which of those forces is at work and which other force it's in tension with. Common AP pitfalls. One mistake students make is treating Reconstruction as a failure and leaving it there. The AP rewards you for recognizing that Reconstruction achieved real gains. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments are constitutional transformations, even as those gains were systematically undermined by the Compromise of 1877 and the withdrawal of federal troops. Another pitfall is forgetting to compare across groups. How did freed people's goals compare to those of white Southern Unionists? How did women reformers see their cause differently than male abolitionists? The more angles you bring, the stronger your argument. As we move into period 6, you'll see how these unresolved tensions over labor, race, and federal power don't disappear, but instead reshape themselves into the conflicts of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era.